So I'm going to welcome everyone here for a distinguished speaker today. And those of you that don't know me, I'm Annette McGee, President of the Historical Society, and we welcome you. Sorry that we have not enough chairs out here, but that's what we get when we get a fantastic speaker. Now, the one thing that we need to do, would you please, for the Historical Society, will you please, if you did not sign in on your way in, there's a book on the table back there that you can sign your name and just where you're from, whether you're Shelton, Union, Potlatch, wherever it happens to be. Wonderful crowd. It isn't often we get these kinds of speakers, and because of that, I've got a little printout here. The presentation you're about to enjoy is part of a Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation, critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to the support from the National Endowment, from the Humanities, the Boeing Company, the Washington Secretary of State, and many private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters will visit all corners of the state of Washington. So our speaker today is in demand all over the state. I'd encourage you to visit their website. They have a website, and of course the website is just like it sounds, humanities.org, to find other times when people are speaking. The Speaker Bureau program is designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing perspectives and viewpoints, but we also ask that you to treat this topic, the speaker and each other, with respect. Our speaker today is an anthropologist, writer, photographer. I understand she's a retired professor from Evergreen College. And
go Gooey Ducks!
Anyone else in good? There? What? Gooey Ducks all over the place. Well, I'm a Coug, I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. Yeah, go Cougs, there we go. Anyway, her experiences included co-producing a film about basket makers Louise Pulsifer and Emily Miller of the Skokomish tribe, working with Japanese American poets and their families on a project called Mountain of Shell, that describes their lives and labor on Oyster Bay in southern Puget Sound, and producing a book of literary history called Katie Gale, a Coast Salish woman, and life on Oyster Bay. She joined the faculty on Evergreen in 1971. And some of her accolades are a Fulbright Scholarship and the Washington State Historical Society's Peace and Friendship Award. She was an expert witness for the Puyallup tribe of Indians and the Confederate tribes of the Colville Reservation. Ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce her to you, I give you a little bit about her background. The other thing that the Humanities for Washington requires us to do is, after you hear her speak, I'm going to hand these out pretty quick. And if you don't have a pen, I'll give you a pen as well. Would you please fill them out and turn them back in to us today, because they have to be turned in, as I understand, after each speaking engagement. We're lucky to have this lady with us today, very fortunate in fact. Yes, ma'am.
Why don't you pass them out now, and then everybody...
Why don't we pass them out now? Sounds like a good one to me. I'll just start them right out here, and they'll take one and pass, they'll be coming down.
Yeah, the humanity.
And you will have them.
Just circle the thumbs up right now.
Yeah, go ahead. With the one thing, though, I would like to say before I introduce our speaker as today is, if any of you are not a member of the Historical Society, please think about very seriously joining. We need your support, and we would love to have you. And anyone that would like to volunteer at the Historical Society, our director, Kristen, We'd be glad to take your name and application, and we'd love to have you as a volunteer. Our dues are only $25 a year, new members. Some of the renewals have been renewing them for $20, and we've been letting it go this year. And we'll let it go probably until about when we have the election of officers again. So, but the new members coming in, $25 a year, and of course that's a family, your husband and wife, or whomever you might be living with at the time. Anyway, without anything further to do, as far as I'm concerned, it is a distinct honor and a privilege to present to you Lynn De Danaan.
Can you hear me through the speaker?
I'm not hearing you right now.
You're not hearing me through the speaker. Let me look at this again, because we do have a new battery. So. Oh, yeah, I guess we have mic. There it is. Okay. We're back in business. All right. All right, now you can hear me through the speaker.
No, I can't. You're going to have to speak right into it.
Can you hear me through the speaker now?
It was working a minute ago.
It is speak. Well, I have to have it hooked to my cheek. This is going to be.
Yeah.
Well, I did have it on my collar, and I don't think that's even close.
Whoops, you dropped.
Hello? Hello?
You dropped.
All right. I'll have to hold it. Well, that's good, except that I hold it, and it's supposed to be a clip-on mic, so that I don't have to hold it. This poses a very interesting question, because I have to show you things, and I have to make the thing go forward. So let me see if I can do it with this thing. That's a brilliant idea. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right then. I hope somebody takes a picture that I can send to Humanities Washington. This is unique. Now we will just try to see if this controls that, and it probably does, but it's not going to work. So let me start at the beginning. First of all, I want to say this is one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm not kidding you. I have two collaborators here, Shirley and Stan. I've worked with them for years. They have been so good and so important to me. We have done a lot together through the years. I have lived on Oyster Bay since 1974, Mason County. So I'm really a Mason County person. And that's why it's so delightful to be here and with you. I see so many friends, and if I'm not mistaken, is that a drawing of Bruce Miller up there? Well, I looked up and I saw Bruce. Bruce was a dear Subaye, Skokomish leader, cultural leader. He was a very, very close and dear friend of mine. So he was one of the first people I met even before I moved to Mason County, through my dear friend Karen James, who was the daughter of David James. Much of David James' stuff from his Simpson years is now deposited in this museum. So this is like, I mean, I was really touched to look up and see Bruce looking at me. Hi. Very, very important person in my life. And so I will also tell you that I just got back 2 days ago from a trip to Baja California to see the gray whales. It was kind of a vacation, but really it's because I'm working on a new book about a woman who grew up on Willapa and whose grandfather was a whaler from Nantucket. So I had to see those whales firsthand. You're working on this.
And did you?
And yes, I did see the whales firsthand. Many gray whales, but they're off our coast right now. They, as you may know, they go to two main lagoons in Baja, and that's where they breed and give birth. And then they start their 1,000-mile journey back up to Alaska and the Bering Sea, and then they come down again next year to breed and give birth. And so we got them like about 2 weeks before the last bunch will be leaving, and they're out on the coast. Yesterday, Quileute had a whale welcoming ceremony. So these are very important creatures, and I'm glad to say they now number about 26,000. They are now off the endangered species list. So this is not what I'm talking about today, but it's important to me that you know about that. So I'm going to move over here so that I can use this hand. I can use this to forward. Oh, it does work? Okay. Probably can put this on your sidebar. My sidebar. I already gave my sidebar. Anyway, so many of you are people I know, friends of mine, and I'm really glad to be here. So today, I have to tell you that if I were starting all over giving this talk, I've been giving this for almost 2 years, this particular talk. If I were starting all over, it would be an entirely new talk. Little did I know when I said I wanted to talk about what does it mean to be human, that within the 2 years that I'm giving the talk, we would have so many finds, so many new analyses, so many new interpretations, that it literally has turned upside down our understanding of human migration around the world. And it's so interesting. Every time I give this talk, I have to spend a couple of weeks adding in new material. And it was a little awkward because I was in Baja, and so I didn't get to add everything. So I made this little chart that you can look at afterwards at your leisure to try to make more sense of all this new material. So you don't worry that you can't read it now, because that's not what I made it for. I made it kind of to get it in my head, and also so that you can look at it later, and I'll be talking through some of the stuff that's on that chart, but not all of it. So this is an exciting time for those of us who are interested in the issue of what it means to be human. And I want us to ponder some of these. Oh, I pointed this, don't I? Shirley, are you sure you got this to work? Oh, you go minus. You go page down, of course. How silly of me. Okay, so just another word of warning, because I'm going to show you some things that I have here. The obsidian is very, very sharp. So I would, if there are children in the audience, I would say supervision. If there are any adults in the audience, I would say handle with care or just look at them. I don't want to be responsible for... Now I tell you. Well, I didn't know you were over there. Well, I did. See, I saw you looking at the ochre. So, yeah, be careful, those obsidians. So, for those of you who want to look at more material, because this is brief, I'm just going to talk, I'm going to bring up some issues and some information and some questions. But if you wanted, the Smithsonian site is absolutely fabulous. And the best people, the most current people in the world are either linked into Smithsonian or link their papers into Smithsonian. So you can, and they have good graphics. You can get a lot of information. So that's humanorigins.si.edu would be the place to go. And you can ask me later if you missed this. We'll go back into the slide. I also have put a lot of material that I find online. I save to Pinterest, to the My Humanities Washington site. So you can go back and look at some of the materials that I've been using, read the full articles, etc. Future Learn is a wonderful place for adult course courses, university level courses, and you do not have to sign up for the credit. You do not have to pay for these things. I have done some amazing coursework through them. A lot of videos, a lot of slides, a lot of lectures, and they're not long lectures. They're clips. Then they'll give you an article. You can have a transcript of the lecture that was given. It's brilliant. I mean, really, it's just, I can't believe how it's so interactive. If you want to engage with other people taking the course, you can. So that's another one. And then, of course, the PBS special, The Great Human Odyssey. And then there's a big history project, which is really for teachers to look at and to get the ideas for teaching some of this material. I think this talk that as in these 2 years that I've been giving it, it's been taking on added meaning for me. What does it mean to be human? With all the wars, the floods, the hurricanes, the threats about nuclear war that keep us up wondering, is this true? Is this really true? Are they just playing with our minds? There's so much hate and so much dissension. There's the legacy of racism and the legacy of colonialism. So what really does it mean to be human? In addition to all these things that I'm trying to learn how to not stay up all night worrying about, there are the advances in technology, the increasing digitization, robotics, genetic engineering, cloning our dogs, really. And the need, so my feeling is there's a need to invest in hard conversations that tackle ethics and morality and underlying cultural philosophy of these digital technologies and other technologies that are changing our lives just as much as we're finding more information about the past. So what does it mean to be human includes these conversations, in my opinion, and which is why it's wonderful to be able to give these humanities talks and just encourage people to think about these things. We are the products of millions of years of struggle, and our ancestors, whoops, sorry, our ancestors really had to deal with enormous changes too, and enormous new technologies and climate change. So we really are the product of a lot of struggle and a lot of strife, and so we hopefully have it somewhere in us to be able to take care of humanity and be the best that humans can be. It's all embedded in our bodies and our brains, and what we do now will determine the future for our next set of human beings. Not just our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but what's going to be life on Earth for human beings in the next centuries. Rilke wrote, and some of you may read Rilke, let this darkness, because I do think we're in a period of darkness and a little bit of gloom, let this darkness be a bell tower, and you the bell. As you ring, what batters you becomes your strength. Move back and forth into the change. So that's a little philosophical piece on what does it mean to be human. And ultimately, it may be, and I'm hoping you ask these questions of yourself, ultimately being human may be being resilient, having resilience as a trait in our lives. But today I'm going to focus more on the material side. Of course, what it means to be human. There are religious answers, there are philosophical answers, there are lots of different ways you could approach this question. I'm going to talk a little bit about the material side today, and not to suggest this is the only way to think about this question. Whoops. These are tiny little buttons and my thumb is big. So, I'm going to talk first about some new material that we have, because as I said, there is always new data. What is that? Oh, the wheel. I'm steering the wheel as I speak. I'm getting us back on course here. So there's always new data, new sites, new analyses, new information, new technologies and interdisciplinary approaches to field work, i.e. archaeological and paleoarchaeology work, and interpretation. Now nowadays, and Karen sent me a really good article about sort of the narrowness of only using the DNA in the genetic material to think about these questions. It was a great article, thank you for that. So I want you to know that, for example, I took a course on the Indonesian persons called Florian Ciensis, and part of the work that we did in that course was to hear from every discipline represented in the analysis of that site. And so for the largest part, there are people from many disciplines working on these questions. So just to name a few: biochemistry, soil chemistry, geology, climatology, DNA, chemical analysis of artifacts and cave walls, faunal and flora analysis, not just archaeology. So do keep that in mind, and when you read things in the newspaper about a new find or a new site, look to see who's involved doing the analysis. Are we only looking at DNA? Because it is short-sighted. But on the other hand, it has given us some incredible new information. The earliest fully modern human, Homo sapiens, is now dated at 300,000 years. It's a site in Morocco. It's a full, I had oh, it's here. Up here you can see the comparison, or not the comparison, but the skull that's been found and analyzed. It is a skull that in many ways, if not every way, fully Homo sapiens skull. They always say this with the people who write these articles always say, if you saw this person walking down the street, you wouldn't think there was anything unusual about him or her. Well, apparently this is more so. This particular find. Those findings were published just in June of 2017 in magazines that I could get access to. We have, and just this is a preview of, because I'll talk a little bit more about Australia, but we have Homo sapiens, human beings, people like us, in Australia by 65,000 years ago. And that's relatively new dating and new information too. And that's interesting. I maybe jumping ahead, but some people have now, because there were Homo erectus, much older. Homo erectus evolved out of Africa about 1.7 million years ago, and Homo erectus made it to Australia and to China, and now there's some thoughts that, well, wait a minute, in order for them to get across the water, I mean, it's not the same sea level as now, but in order for them to get from island to island and into the Indonesian islands, for example, they must have had the capacity to somehow communicate with each other, because they had to paddle something. They had to paddle something, and they had to somehow give directions. Paddle hard left, hard right. Not with those words, but something. So that's a theory. That's just a theory out there, but it's questionable. It's a good question, because apparently they were in the Indonesian islands, and that's pretty important stuff to think. Now, mind you, when I talk about these archaic humans or pre-Homo sapiens, we're not saying these are straight lines. Nobody's saying, oh, this evolved from that, evolved from this, evolved from that. These are groups of populations that, along the way to Homo sapiens, were breeding populations big enough that we are finding all these variants all over the world of human-like creatures. and that we've named, and we've got skulls, and we've got information. So we'll go ahead with that. This is the Morocco thing. The face of these people is a face like my face. It's a face like somebody you could cross in the street today. So that's one of the writers of the information. Still significant differences. There's the suspicion now is there is whatever the differences are. Is that me? Okay, I don't know if I turned my thing off. Okay. There's a suspicion that we have no way of knowing precisely that more evolution after 300,000 years might include some morphological, but probably at least how the brain is wired is the way the author of the article put it, that there's something about cognition and other things, the way we think, that would have been changing through those 300,000 years from there until today. But those are things that are hard. I mean, that's the soft stuff inside of these brain cases that we can find in the ground. This is interesting. The previous exodus from Africa of Homo sapiens, now those Homo sapiens, you remember that Morocco site is right across from Spain, right? That's about, what did I figure? I looked this up. That's about 7.7 miles from Spain. So I would not say that it's not possible that we won't find more early human Homo sapiens in Europe. But right now we don't have that. But so we have the first exodus from Africa that we have been able to date is a site in Misla, Mount Carmel, near Haifa, I believe, 170 to 194,000 years before the present. Before that, and this is relatively recent, and you can read about this on the Smithsonian site that I directed you to. There's been several, and by the way, somebody asked me, why are we finding all this stuff now? Are people just lucky all of a sudden all of this stuff is... No, it's the increase in technology at many levels, including DNA. But the people working on this site, this just got reported, I don't know, within the last year, but they've been working on this for years, this site, years and years. People's whole careers have been dedicated to some of these sites that we're just now getting the dates, just now getting the information, and they're just now able to publish some of this stuff, feel confident enough in what they've got. So there's the Mount Carmel site. You see the difference? This is just in the last year that we're reading about this. 60,000 to 170 to 194,000. That's why I say the whole thoughts, all the paradigms that we've had for how humans migrated from where and when is upside down now. Upside down is not really the right word, but it's changed dramatically. Archaeologists, this is from July last year, archaeologists have found the first evidence to suggest that Aboriginal people have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years. Their arrival on the continent now is 18,000 years earlier than what was previously thought. Sophisticated artifacts excavated from a rock shelter in the Northern Territory unearthed what they think are the world's oldest stone axes and ochre crayons used for art. And an ochre crayon, you can look at this stuff later, but there's some lumps of ochre up here. And you can touch and feel these, or, well, that's a towel. But if you have a piece of paper, yeah, I was going to say you can write on the towel. But, you know, try it. You can see that you can just make marks with this stuff. I've got powdered ochre, so you can, don't open it, but you can see that this could easily be, and this was ground and put into things like this, a shell, and then you've got a little paint palette. You put other things in with that. You can use feathers to do your shading, and you can do moss to color broad segments. So things like this were going on. Things like this were going on in Australia before our very famous French and Spanish cave paintings that we all have seen and loved. And I used to carry the horses from Chauvet. How do you say that? It's French. Chauvet?
Yes, that means not Lascaux.
No, the Chauvet is the one I had. And then I thought, well, what we're finding out is that whole notion, that whole paradigm of the earliest art being in Europe was very Eurocentric, friends. In fact, I meant to bring, I think I did bring it, I'll dig it out later. But there was a new photograph just published yesterday, a reconstruction of the Cro-Magnon man. And Cro-Magnon was considered the first Homo sapiens in Europe for years and years and years. And, you know, dates back maybe 35,000 years. I've forgotten exactly what. But anyway, and when I was still in school, which was about a century ago, no kidding, we used to have these depictions, right, in our textbooks of the Neanderthal. It was like, and then with the humpback, and there's a reason for that. The skeleton they had actually had arthritis. So now we know that. But they used to, when I was in school, all Neanderthals looked like that, and I think it was, what's her, the writer, the cave bear. I think she had them carrying a stick so they could stand up. Well, and then the Cro-Magnon was, you know, sort of a blonde, tall, handsome-looking guy. No, that's what I was taught. So yesterday, they've done a reconstruction of the Cro-Magnon. Oh my God, he had this horrible-looking face, and now they're basing that on the poor guy had a genetic disease. The skeleton that they were analyzing, and so it doesn't look anything like this tall, elegant Aryan that we used to have in our textbooks as the comparison with the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal looks pretty doggone good by comparison. I mean, you know. So anyway, these are the things you have to watch for, these biases, and we call it scientific racism, basically. Okay, we went the wrong way. There's some other interesting things we found with DNA. For example, there's a 2015 report, that shows a genetic link between some of the Amazonian tribes and some of the indigenous Australia. So you can see where the red dots match up and where the yellow dots match up. This is a very peculiar thing. I haven't seen a lot published on this, but it suggests that there could have been some admixture across the ocean and some other ways between the South American populations and the people in Australia and in New Guinea and so forth. So that's another new thing.
When did Pangea break up?
But millions of years before that. No. That wouldn't have come.
Changed.
No, that would. They'd have to have come across the water to have that kind of thing going on, which is not that hard. You get into the Japanese current. There's the Jomo pottery. Some of the first pottery in South America is on the coast, and the Jomo pottery in South America. It's not. You know, it's like 15 or 12,000 years. I've forgotten the dates now. I shouldn't even talk about it. But it matches up very nicely with pottery at the same period in Japan. So I don't know. I'm so too far back. Say 4,000 years ago, and then look it up. But very clearly could have caught the Japanese current and come across and down and landed. A very likely landing place would be, even if it were by accident, would be that coast of South America. So here's one that I put up to say we must be cautious. For example, this came out April 2017. The startling new report asserts the first Americans arrived much earlier than scientists thought, more than 100,000 years ago. So, and maybe they were Neanderthals. Well, this was the finding in California, mammoth bones and rock on top of those bones that appeared to have been made by a human. The scarring, and this is one of the things we have to know. We have to know a scar on a rock, whether it's made by human beings or made by geological processes. And it's pretty easy to tell, and that's why this was a pretty interesting find, all right. But do we take that at face value? Well, the archaeologists put the paper out. It was peer reviewed. It would change everything that we know about the peopling of the North American and South American continent. If we really thought there were Homo sapiens or Neanderthals here on these continents 100,000 years ago, I mean, let's get digging. Let's find some more, because I'm going to skip that, because they are theories and speculation only. There's only one data point. We only have one example of this claim, and so it's not something to draw conclusions from at this time. I did talk to an archaeologist when I was over in the Channel Islands last spring, who knows the archaeologists. He's an archaeologist, and he knows the people who made this finding, made this analysis, and made this report. And he says they're very good people, they're very trustworthy, they've done good work, and he said, I've seen those rocks, but he said, you know, again, it's one data point. It's way too early to start making any kind of claims, but stay tuned. And that's something you can watch for, and just saying that it's useful to remember these concepts: speculation, theory, hypothesis, critical thinking. There's some other things. Genetic drift is an important concept for understanding some of the things you're going to be reading all the time in the newspapers. If you read newspapers at all, or the news online, or follow the Smithsonian Human Origins, you're going to see things coming out, and you need to be able to separate what is data from pure speculation, theory, and hypotheses, and that means thinking critically. And you know, it's a hard thing to do, in the sense of we like this fancy stuff, we like this exciting stuff, but it's not the way to really approach this subject matter. It really requires that we look carefully at how people are drawing conclusions and making these kind of claims. Remember, as most of you I'm sure know, that we're looking for explanations, but we have to have empirical support for those explanations. It has to account, the explanation has to account for most, if not all, of the data that we have, and we have to be rigorous. We have to see that the people telling us these things are applying scientific principles rigorously. It's fun to consider facts and try to figure out what they mean. We do that all the time. I was just on boats with friends that were watching the gray whales down on the two lagoons in Baja. And it's all very ethically done, very respectful, very ecological consciousness of the people that take the boats down there and so forth. But on the boat, in our excitement, people began to assign motives to every whale that approached our boat. And it was sort of like this. It was so exciting. We got so caught up in the excitement. Oh, she likes me. She's coming to me again. She likes me. Oh, she liked it when I whistled. Oh, let's sing. I think they like that. Don't you think? Oh, that one's going under the boat. She probably wants to play with us. We do this. We are, and perhaps that's part of what it means to be human. We make these kinds of assumptions, and especially when we're excited. So somebody says there could have been Neanderthals in California 100,000 years ago. I say, yeah, oh, wow, okay. So we have to stop ourselves and think a little more carefully. And I want to quote someone here in this audience. The plural of anecdote is not data. That's Karen. Put your hand up, Karen. She's a friend of mine, and I love that phrase. I use it all the time. So when we read reports in the newspaper, we have to ask, what is the author's argument? What's the evidence? What's the data? How is it organized? And what isn't accounted for? We need to teach our children and grandchildren to do that too, because we have so many competing ways of thinking out there, and good for you if you can help more people understand how to think critically. So back to the question. I haven't even looked at a clock. How much do I have?
Go for it.
Go for it, okay. But essentially, you're thinking you're here till about 3 o'clock, right? From,
Till dark.
okay. 4 o'clock?
Whatever.
I'll hang around. You expected 2 hours. Wait a minute. Anyway, so here we are. So we'll begin with that. DNA analysis and the sequencing of the human genome have revolutionized what we know about human evolution, our ancestors, our cousins, and our relationships to each other over the globe. So giving due credit, this is we know this is true. It's amazing stuff. Just to put some perspective to what follows, this, again, I'm going to repeat this, what we thought until the find from Morocco. We thought that 115,000 years ago, early modern humans had expanded their range to South Africa, Southwest Asia, and reliable evidence of modern humans in the old world was 60 to 40,000 years ago. Here's an interesting map. This is not fully in focus, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you can probably see the red dots and the white dots and the yellow dots. So these are the traces of early humans that we had up until all this new material. But so this is a good little thing to show you. But I want you to have a time frame that helps thinking about this 300,000 versus the 195,000. We have this early archaic species called Homo floresiensis in Indonesia 700,000 years ago. This is not Homo sapiens, but this is contemporaneous with the Homo erectus, which started evolving and traveling 1.7 million years ago. This creature is on one island, the Flores Island, made stone tools in Indonesia, on the island. This is one of those populations, like the Channel Islands has pygmy mammoths and pygmy foxes. Well, that's when you live on islands for a long time, you start to become small. Miniaturization occurs. Now, it takes a long time. It's not like Bainbridge Island people are going to get tiny. But this creature did. That creature was there long enough that was very short. There's extensive research. That's what I was talking about, the multidisciplinary approach to the analysis of that site. Extensive research has been done. It was probably, they think, up till 50,000 years ago, which means, because we have Homo sapiens in Australia, that it was contemporaneous during a period of time with Homo sapiens. You see, we've got that going on. Now, just to put this into perspective again, Kennewick, which most of us know or heard about or followed, Kennewick is only 9,000 years old. It's like, you know, what's the big deal? But still, it's a good example of premature speculation, you know, in this case. Very premature. Lots of political problems, lots of havoc because of the early speculation. So, but only 9,000 years, and here we have in Indonesia 700,000 years ago. So this is just more explanation on the Kennewick, and you probably, how many of you know about Kennewick and have followed some of this? So you know that the remains have now been returned for some time and respectfully buried in a private place. And But this is, Kennewick is part of the archaic or Paleo-Indian population that we're finding throughout the North American continent. And we do have a new site 14,000 years before the present off British Columbia. By the way, a lot of the North American sites around Alaska, British Columbia, off the coast, they're underwater. They're going to be found underwater, if they're found at all, because sea level changes. So they're part of our incomplete picture of human migration is due to massive climate change, including sea level changes. So, you know, what will we find? There are, of course, people doing underwater archaeology, and actually there's been quite a lot around Vancouver Island, some in Alaska. So that's another thing to keep your eye on. New methods, we don't have to talk about that. Genetic research and applications is causing us to face all kinds of new and troubling information, but we can learn a lot about ourselves. I put this up here because I happen to know, because I did one of those sites where you can send your spittle in, and I found out that I have 314 Neanderthal variants. More than 93% of other customers of 23andMe. That's pretty good.
It was 280.
You've got 280 variants. Does anyone else know many of their variants they have, Stan?
61.
61, okay. So we don't all have the same amount, and there are certain populations that have none of it because of how Neanderthal spread and where the sites were that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens interbred. My very first anthropology, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, can't they check for the other strains? I mean, I don't understand. When you get like 23andMe, you had these variants, but what about the other DNA from other?
Oh yes, they give you a full
Okay.
well, they don't give you a full report because this is evolving. This is all evolving. 23andMe and these other sites pretty much are running your data against other people who have used 23andMe or whichever site you're using. So these things change. That's another thing that's changing daily. The more information from the more human beings all over the world, the more we're going to know about human migration. And so yes, we're just at the beginning of this stuff. And yes, so you will see more. Now, here is a route that includes some of the places where there was possible mixture with Neanderthals, but there's some of us carry also Denisovan genetic material, and that is also an archaic. When we say archaic, there's a new way of classifying. It used to be that there were subspecies thought of as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, for example. More now, scientists are using the term archaic humans for those Homo sapien creatures who became extinct. So Neanderthals as a Neanderthal became extinct. Denisovans became extinct. We consider them archaic Homo sapiens. And so there's mixture with Homo sapiens and Denisovans in this Siberian cave. I'll show you some material from that cave site. And also up in this area with, and so what you get is you don't get the Neanderthal gene sort of further towards China and Asia, but out in the Pacific, in particular Melanesia and Papua, you get a lot of Denisovan in the genetic material of Homo sapiens. So there's all kinds of interesting mapping of this going on and questions being asked. And some studies now suggest that the Neanderthal genetic material transferred a bit of immunity to the Homo sapiens that were mixed with the Neanderthal, that there was some advantage to some of that genetic material surviving. Same with Denisovan. So interesting stuff to read about. I love this stuff, and I encourage you to read about it. Whether or not you have your own stuff tested, that's up to you, but it's just kind of fun. Knowing that I am part Neanderthal really gives me pause on this question of what it means to be human. I'll just say that. But still, there's something about the Homo sapiens who have survived and dominated the Earth that must have been giving us an edge in some way. And one of the things that comes out when you look at the Neanderthal versus the Homo sapiens of today is the Neanderthal really didn't change their toolkit for the whole 100,000 years or so that they were around. They didn't innovate, in other words. We know, and I'll show you some examples, we know that they were making art in caves. We know that they were massive hunters, tool users, but they kind of invented a particular set of tools and didn't really improve on those tools. That's a very Homo sapiens-centered thing to say improve upon them. Well, did they need to? Well, apparently when they encountered Homo sapiens who kept making new tools and changing their toolkit, it was a disaster for the survival of Neanderthals. So this is one thing we can question. We used to say, though, when I was in graduate school, and certainly as an undergraduate, we always said, man the hunter. There was a book we had to read, Man the Hunter. And it was as if we were the only ones, Homo sapiens were the only ones that used tools. And that was the criterion, right? We are different, we are Homo sapiens, we use tools. And, well, we weren't the only ones. So this is a Homo erectus toolkit. These are tools found in Lake Turkana 3.3 million years ago. I mean, they were made 3.3 million years ago. There they are. So amazing stuff. And that was a toolkit. It's, of course, long extinct. And this is a Pleistocene site. That 3.3 is wrong. That should say 1.3. That's just wrong. So they call the Acheulean industry, tool industry. Archaeologists long ago gave names to some of these styles of tool making. So these first archaic tools were called Acheulean. And they first began using these tools, as it says here, 1.6. So that's the earliest date we have at this point. Also, charred animal bones and so forth suggest that they made use of fire. But other creatures use tools. So man the tool maker? No, I don't think so. We have crow the tool maker. We have chimp the tool maker, at least tool using. But now we know, if you've seen the studies from University of Washington, that crows alter tools, alter things, make hooks out of things so that they can reach certain objects. So it's not just tool user. They are making tools. They are creating tools that can be used for specific purposes. Neanderthals, certainly, we've talked about this. These are called the Mysterian tradition, so a slightly different tradition. But as I said, this style of tool making lasted from 100,000 to about 40,000 with little change. So they were not finding ways to flake things differently or attach them differently and so forth. So that's one of the things we wonder about is was the innovative capacity or need or goodness knows the will of human beings to, if you've read Faust, it's a kind of a Faustian dilemma. It's like, if ever I say to the passing hour, linger a while, thou art so fair. That's in Faust by Goethe, and it has to do with the suggestion that human beings can't just relax and sit still. They're always having to make things and create things and move ahead and do something more and acquire more. So that's a philosophical take on this. So experimentation, adaptation, trial and error, improvements made for gain, or without regard, perhaps, for future cost. That's the Faustian dilemma, or the Faustian bargain, I should say. So, thus, though many of us are carrying, as we said, Neanderthal genes, Neanderthal even had a greater cranial capacity, but is it creativity that makes us modern Homo sapiens? One of the other social, cultural, and technological inventions of Homo sapiens, human beings, social group, caring for others, ritual and symbolic behavior, something that allows for collective learning and sharing of information, fire making and preserving. Well, we've just said that we know that the Homo erectus could do that. Building structures, painting, body adornment, clothing, especially making tailored clothing, language and music. All of these have been, at some point or another, put forward as what it means to be human, Homo sapiens, modern, that we have all of these. But indeed, there's growing evidence for all of these, that creatures other than Homo sapiens have these capacities and have these cultural attributes in their way of being in the world. So I'm going to look at some of these. Here is an example of Neanderthal constructions inside caves as places for hearths and gatherings and being safe. So you can see that there's a kind of a circular arrangement. Sometimes it's rock, sometimes it's bone. That's made to enclose a space. So this particular site is 175,000 years before the present. You can see that it's about a quarter mile into a cave site. This one includes the cave below includes a series of scorched fire pits. So we know that people were gathering there, and we know that they were building fires. And given the animal bones and the other artifacts found, sites for butchery, sites for cooking, and so forth. That cave was occupied during a very cold period, and because that cave was in southern France, and you can see approximately where France is, and that's the glaciated period, ended about 130,000 years before present. So this would have been a site that was not far from the terminal point of the glacier of that period. So they were in these caves, they had fires, they were making fur clothing, they were being as comfortable as they could be. There's also evidence in some of the Neanderthal sites now that Neanderthals were very tidy. They strategically placed their hearth separate from places for butchering and separate from places for tool making. And that, of course, is all evidence from archaeological sites. You can, as you're digging and going through the inches and meters of debris that's left, you can tell where these things happen. This is one that was formed with using mammoth bones, which were decorated by the Neanderthal inhabitants of this area. The lack of wood in this area led people to use bones instead for creating living spaces. Circular house made of 116 large bones, including mammoth skulls, jaws, 14 tusks, and leg bones. So clearly they were successful at getting a mammoth, and then at butchering, and then at saving the bones and using them in a variety of ways. Inside the house, cave house, were at least 25 hearths. 25 hearths, suggesting it had been used for many, many years by many people. Neanderthal, of course, controlled fire. There's now some studies that suggest they were using manganese dioxide to actually start the fire. That also can be used as a pigment. The manganese is used as a black pigment. This is a knockout bracelet. You may have seen this. This is Denisovan. So this is another archaic human species that is extinct, but who has genetic material that lives on in some of the people in the Far East, in Melanesia, I think Melanesia and Papuans have the highest percentage of Denisovan. So this is found in the Altai region of Siberia, this particular cave and artifact, and it's made of chlorite stone. And you know, the chlorite, as I recall, was not from there. They had to, this was either traded or they carried it from another place. They sought that stone. And this is very, I'd love to see this in person, but apparently this is very finely formed and, you know, basically somehow ground to make a